My grandparents had a humble farm located in a small hollow. It wasn't a commercial farm, just something on the side they had to support themselves. When they got older and it was more difficult for them to maintain the farm, they quit using the barn. The barn just sort of sat there and was used as a storage area mainly. Every Thanksgiving, we would go to our grandparents' house. The past couple of times we went have felt different. My dad left us a few years ago, and I began to not enjoy hanging out with the adults in my family anymore. Suddenly, listening to the stories of when I was a kid, or when my mom was a kid, just wasn't that entertaining anymore. We had Thanksgiving dinner early. It was about 2 p.m. Afterward, I was beginning to feel a bit antsy as the boring family conversations started. I let my mom know that I was going to head out and explore the hollow a little bit. It had been a while since I had looked around their property. I didn't even think of asking my younger brother and sister if they wanted to go, but ultimately it was fine because I sort of felt like being by myself anyway. My stepdad patted me on the back and told me to be back by dark. He was always good to me and my mom. He made her feel happy right when she was at a low in her life from the divorce. I set out and made sure I knew how far I could go. I didn't do the greatest job at it though. If you have ever been wandering out, exploring the woods, you might know what I mean. You can easily get fascinated with the woods and the hills and lose track of time. It got very dark before I was anywhere close to being home. By the time I got back to the farm, it had been dark for at least an hour. I'd never been out by the barn while it was dark outside. It looked incredibly creepy. Being a teenage boy, I of course loved scary things. The thought then occurred to me that if the barn was creepy looking on the outside, it must be really creepy on the inside. So I decided to check it out. Getting into the barn was simple. My grandparents rarely locked the doors of their house, much less the thought about locking the barn. They lived in a really safe area where crime was pretty much unheard of. The barn did have one of those heavy wooden locks on it. I honestly have no idea what they're called, but I was able to pull the wooden beam up. When I opened the barn door, it made a horribly loud creaking noise. I knew my grandparents had likely not been in the barn for years, so I was surprised I was able to get the door open at all. As I mentioned, the barn was old, and even when it was in use, my grandparents would have only been in it during the day, so there was no light. I withdrew my phone and turned on the flashlight feature, then marveled at the creepiness. I was fascinated by all of the tools. So many sharp implements. Most of them were hanging up. However, there was a small hatchet lying on the workbench. It was discolored, and upon closer inspection, I realized that it was coated in dry blood. My stomach felt uneasy, but then it occurred to me. I don't know much about slaughtering animals, but I knew that my grandparents used to do it often. Chickens and pigs and stuff. My mental justification had lulled my nerves back down. The barn had a loft that was filled with hay, and I decided to climb the ladder and check it out. When I was shining the light around, it reflected off something that was buried in the hay. I was wondering if it was another tool or something, and decided to check it out. Going over to it, I began moving the hay. I screamed when empty eye sockets of a long-dead corpse were gazing directly at me. I fell backwards and nearly fell off the loft. I quickly climbed down the ladder in a panic and ran out of the barn without closing the door. I busted into the house and told my mom and grandparents about what I'd seen. My mom called the police. She said my stepdad had went out looking for me after the sun went down. We later found out that the skeleton in the barn was my real dad, missing for 3 years. My stepfather has warrants out for his arrest and connection. He's never returned.